turn to the book of Philippians. Now, this is going to be an interesting study for several reasons. Do you remember from Acts chapter 16 how the church at Philippi got started? Remember the story? There's two very important stories in Acts 16 that talk about the planting of the church there. If you have your Bible, let's turn to Acts 16, because I think it's a good way to set stage for the study. Let's really start at verse 11, Acts 16:11. From Troas, we put out to sea and sailed straight for Samothrace. And the next day we went on to Neapolis. From there, we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony and the leading city of that district of Macedonia. Now, it's interesting that Paul has or Luke in Acts here, has a very quick cultural comment about Philippi and then moves on. One of the things that we'll try to do starting next week is I want to talk about Philippi being a Roman colony and why that was important. And it's a leading city of that district or that area of Macedonia. In the book of Philippians, Paul is going to refer to citizenship, and he's going to make a fantastic point that his readers living in Philippi would have completely understood about being a Christian using that illustration. Now, verse 13, on the Sabbath, we went outside of the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. Now, the reason that that's recorded that way is because in many of your Roman colonies, there may not have been, and I think Philippi certainly qualified here, enough male Jews to start a synagogue. I don't think that there's ever been discovered remains of a synagogue in Philippi, but I'll double check on that. Chris and I both like archaeological excavations. So Chris, what we'll do is let's see if we can find there's ever been excavation evidence, of a Jewish synagogue in Philippi. But this comment makes you feel like that at least at that point, there wasn't one. And so apparently there was kind of the custom or the practice. And Paul and the group, they may have heard that there was a group praying down by the river. They went outside the city gate. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. Remember, we talked about when we talked about the seven churches of Asia in the book of Revelation, how that Thyatira was known all over the world for dealing in purple dye. Well, it makes sense then that she's from there and she's a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God. Now, and we will talk a little bit more about this when we get into Philippians further. There were people that were known as worshipers of God. And many of these would have been recognized as having Jewish background. And they may not have been following everything in the synagogue, but they wanted to be devoted to God. And it looks like in Acts that some of the most receptive people early on to the gospel were these individuals called worshipers of God, which is kind of fascinating because notice the next comment. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. Now that's an interesting thing because it ties into a perspective on conversion that we need to be aware of. And that is that the Lord and the Holy Spirit are involved in the conversion process. When I was growing up, the only thing that was emphasized was the human part of conversion. Well, I mean, there is the human response, but don't leave God out of the equation for sure. That's why in Acts 2, in fact, turn over to Acts chapter 2, there's a fascinating reference. Notice in 2:37, this is right after Peter concludes, his concluding sentence in his presentation. We call it the first gospel sermon. Therefore, let all Israel be assured of this. God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Messiah. Notice when the people heard this, they were cut to the heart and said to Peter and the other apostles, brothers, what shall we do? This is a recognition that God is involved in the process of conversion when people are cut to the heart. And here it says that the Lord opened Lydia's heart. So the heart, as you know, is involved in the conversion process, and it certainly is indicated here. Verse 15, when she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. If you consider me a believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay at my house, and she persuaded us. And then you have the story right after that of Paul and Silas in prison at Philippi, and guess what? The jailer that's watching them, he and his household are baptized. So this is the beginning of the planting of the Philippian church. And the thing about Paul and Silas in prison that I've often wondered, notice that it says, it was, what was it, about midnight? Where is the reference? About verse 25, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. So do you realize that hymns being sung can be a way to share the gospel? And we don't often think about that, do we? But it makes you wonder, wouldn't you love to know the exact hymns they were singing that Philippian jailer heard? That's what I'd like to know, but we're not told that in detail, okay? So you have in chapter 16 the beginnings of the church. Now, what's also fascinating to me in the book of Philippians, you don't have Lydia or the Philippian jailer mentioned or referenced in the book of Philippians. Were they part of the original congregation of Philippi? Probably. How long? We don't know, and Paul doesn't mention. So just so that you know, that's the background in which the church was planted. Now, I want to talk a moment about a significant theme in the book of Philippians, because Nancy's study Bible at home had a really good thing where at the beginning on the front page of Philippians, it had what was called mega themes. And it was interesting because one of the big mega themes that was mentioned, I've always sort of chosen this, but one of them has to do with what I've chosen to be really kind of the basic theme of Philippians. And it's interesting because your Bible had a 4-part outline on Philippians, and every major part of the outline had this word in it that I've chosen that I think is the basic theme. And if you look at a lot of Christian writers through the years, they've said this too. But let's look at some of them and mention some of the mega themes. Number one is humility. Okay. And this is interesting because in chapter 2, humility is identified with the mindset of Jesus Christ. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. And we're going to look at, what does it mean to have the mind of Jesus? How do you know if you have it or if you don't? Because it looks like the way Paul's talking about, to have the mind of Jesus is the mindset of the Christian life. And so as we work through chapter 2, we'll have to ask ourselves, is this how I truly think? Or am I a long ways from there yet? So we'll look at that. The second is self-sacrifice. Okay, and it's interesting that it's recognized as a big theme, and it's the self-sacrifice first of Jesus, then of Paul, and what he wants of them. as readers. So that self-sacrifice is at the core of the Christian's life. Thinking about Jesus, how you think about yourself, and decisions you make, so that, and here's what's interesting. When you become a Christian, and we're going to see this all through Philippians, Paul is trying to make the case over and over and over. When you become a Christian, the world is no longer about you. You are saved to serve. And that service may even get to the point, and many times it does, of self-sacrifice. I'm giving up myself for God. What does that look like? A very important theme. Then there is the issue of unity. It looks like, and we're going to get to this later in the book of Philippians, that there were two women in the congregation that couldn't get along. Let's turn over. I want to ask this question. Turn over to Philippians 4. Okay. Chapter 4, verse 1. Therefore, my brothers and sisters, you whom I love and long for my joy and crown, stand firm in the Lord in this way, dear friends. Now, I'm going to read verse 2, and I want you to think, and we don't know how large the church at Philippi was. It may still have been a house church. Maybe 20 at the most. If it was meeting somewhere else, maybe 40 at the most. Early congregations were not large, okay? What if you were either Euodia or Syntyche, and you're sitting there, and all of a sudden this gets read out loud with your names in it? And this is the first time you've heard this. I plead with Euodia and I plead with Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. And yes, I ask you, my true companion. Now, the word true companion is a word, I think one translation says yoke fellow, but then there's also the Greek word for it that some people think instead of true companion, it's actually a person's name. He's referring to a person. But I ask you, my true companion, help these women since they have contended at my side in the cause of the gospel. So not only does he want them to get their act together, he wants this companion person to step along and help them to work things out. So apparently it's got to a pretty bad spot. And what we want to do is look at the issue of unity in the small congregation at Philippi and just how critical it is. Remember, as it goes back to the mindset of Jesus. Then there's a ton of stuff. Let's just call this a Christian living. Throughout Philippians, there's a lot of wonderful, what I would call day-to-day principles that we need to be aware of as we try to live out the Christian life. Very, very important. And then number 5, the key theme of joy and rejoicing. And especially for Paul, because, and this may be surprising, because just in the first chapter alone, 3 times, he indicates that he's in chains. So this is one of the prison epistles, one of Paul's letters while he's in prison. I noticed the NIV doesn't use the word chains. It uses the word, where is it? To know Christ. Thought it was, okay. Well, in verse 17 it does. One place I thought it used the word, it was another English translation. In the NIV it does use chains. Chapter 1, verse 7. Chapter 1.
It says,
117.
chains.
One translation said imprisonment, and I thought, I like the word chains because that gives you a much more visual picture. He is constricted. I mean, he's not free to go wherever he wants. He's chained up. And so even though he's imprisoned and in chains, he can write a letter on joy and rejoicing. And what we have to ask is, how can he do that? Because the human response would be, I don't belong here, and get depressed and like, this isn't fair. And you can get bitter toward those that threw you in there. I mean, there's all kinds of human responses available, and Paul doesn't choose those. Instead, he chooses joy and rejoicing. And we're going to have to ask, how does he do that? Can we do that? You know, it's those kind of questions that we have to ask when we go through that. Okay. So these are some of the big mega themes. You might find as you're going through Philippians, another one or two of the big themes you'd like to add to this. But it is a very special letter. In fact, I wanted to share with you a verse that lets you know how special the Philippian church was to Paul. So turn over to Philippians 4:15. He's talking about the church there in 4:14. Yet it was good of you to share in my troubles. Moreover, as you Philippians know, in the early days of your acquaintance with the gospel, when I set out from Macedonia, not one church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, except you only. Oh, so in the early days when Paul's on the go and he's needing support and people to really take him in and take care of him so he can keep preaching the gospel. Bible scholars aren't sure what to make of this. I'm gonna throw out a hunch. I think this may be in Galatians a reference where Paul says after his early conversion, and I think it took a while to get over this, Barnabas was the only one that would come along and say, come on, folks, you need to accept this guy. This is my brother, Paul. And then people in the church were like, oh, I'm not sure about that. He's a guy that used to, throw Christians in prison and have them stoned. You're telling us to accept him? And I think it took a while for the churches. And it's interesting that Paul could plant churches, but then perhaps people become members of it after Paul left. But there's some of them still have remembered some of those stories of, well, he's this guy that used to kill Christians. So when he's at an important point where he needs support from some of these congregations, he must have had enough naysayers that the churches weren't excited to jump on board and support him. Only the church of Philippi. Now, that's an interesting little comment, but that's how special the church at Philippi was to Paul. And I think there was just that little special place in his heart for this group of Christians, okay? Okay, any comments or questions up to this point? There is another significant theme, and I'll add this as number 6, a mega theme, is because of what Paul does. It's the idea of fellowship. And sometimes the word together is used, and sometimes the word partaker. And I want to show you something that's fascinating that Paul does. I'm going to put the word noun up here and the word verb. So there are times when Paul will use nouns and verbs, and he does something with them in the Greek language we can't do in English. But they're all over the book of Philippians. And the reason I think that Paul does it, by the Spirit, of course, but it's to demonstrate just how critical fellowship is, this idea of being together with each other in Christ. The preposition with, he will take it and use it as a compound syllable on the front of words. It's with. And what I'll do is I'll share. Oh, okay. Look at 1:7. And here's how the NIV does it. It's right for me to feel this way about all of you, since I have you in my heart, See, there again, notice that special reference. I have you in my heart. And whether I'm in chains or defending, confirming the gospel, all of you share in God's grace with me. Okay, that's a good way of saying it in English, but it is the word with partakers. So he uses the word partakers, your partakers, but he puts on the front of the noun partakers the preposition with. You are with partakers. Well, that's bad English for us. So I like the way the NIV actually translates it. You share in God's grace with me. But see, notice that close connection. We're all partakers together, and with me, we're sharing in God's grace. So, we'll point this out as we go along because it can be done. It's kind of unusual, but we're going to find all through the book of Philippians where Paul, by the Spirit, sort of creates these compound words. Now, if you know German, German does that all the time. Compound words like that. So it's an interesting thing about the language, and where we will see it in our English translations, like I said, you'll have the word fellowship, the word together, partakers with. Oh, another, often when you come across the idea of sharing together, it'll kind of indicate that's where that's happening. So for Paul, well, here's what we have to ask in Philippians. Why is fellowship so vital to the life of the congregation? Well, and what does it look like? What is Christian fellowship? And it's over against the question, well, what is pagan fellowship? Well, when we were going through First and Second Corinthians, we learned pretty quickly what pagan fellowship looked like. You know, they would eat meat together in the marketplace just down the road from the temple. Some of those places of eating were connected to the temple. Pagan fellowship was easy to find. Well, what does Christian fellowship look like? And why is it important? And so we'll look at that, the nature of Christian fellowship. Okay. So we've looked at the background of how the church got started. Those are wonderful stories. If you want to, take time and read Acts 16 for more detail. We've already looked at, and I want to look at two things that are driving, I think, the letter from Paul's pastoral perspective. Look at chapter 1, verse 10. And this is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that, see, anytime you come across so that, it's an important phrase, because that means purpose. Why is he praying for them so much? So that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ, and to the glory and praise of God. Paul's concern is so that they will know how to discern what is best, to live out the Christian life, and to be blameless at his coming. This is a significant theme all through Paul's letters. He wants his readers to be blameless at the coming of Jesus Christ. Now, when we read that, unfortunately, we almost think we're saying, well, that means we have to be perfect when he comes back. Well, if that's what that means, we're all in trouble. It's from an Old Testament background. And guess what? It's within this idea of sacrifice. And when we get to looking at that verse more closely, we'll talk about, what does Paul mean by this? What is he after? So that his readers can know they're specifically being prepared for Christ's coming, to be blameless at his coming. So this is one of the important things for Paul. Look in chapter 128. See, look at, well, start with verse 27. Whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. There's your Christian living. And that's very important for Paul. Whatever happens, you just conduct yourself in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. And he's assuming that he can say that after you understand what the mind of Christ is. Once you understand the mind of Christ, then you conduct yourself in such a way that you're worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then whether I come and see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you stand firm in one spirit. So there's your emphasis on unity, striving together as one for the faith of the gospel. And look at verse 28. Without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you. So there's some kind, we're going to see some of it. There's some kind of opposition going on that it seems like it's pretty intense. And Paul is worried that it's at such a level it's going to affect their faith. And this is a strong pastoral concern he has all through book of Philippians. Without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you. They have some opposition. And one of the things that you can be sure of when you live the Christian life, Satan's going to provide opposition. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And so he wants them to be prepared, not caught off guard, because they have opposition. This is a sign to them that will be destroyed, but that you'll be saved and that by God. You'll be saved by God because it's been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him. The early church in the preaching of the gospel heard two things. And notice, again, it goes back to number 2 with this self-sacrifice. When you're saved to serve God and to live out the gospel and proclaim the gospel, along with being saved, you could count on suffering. Now, we live in a different day and time than Paul did. But I think we all would agree, it just seems like when you embrace the Christian life, maybe there's an additional element of suffering, or for sure you become more aware of suffering in your life. And if you're not careful, Satan can use that to weaken and destroy your faith, or you can come to that recognizing, well, I'm one of God's chosen through Christ. And guess what? We live in an imperfect world filled with sin and sufferings all over the place. That's just part of the human experience. And here's what's really cool about your faith. When you stand firm in your faith, no matter what happens, when you conduct yourself worthy of the gospel of Christ, no matter what the suffering is, you do not let that move you from Jesus. That's the message, and it's a powerful one. And maybe we don't say it enough to each other, but that's awful powerful, isn't it? Okay. Comments or questions so far at this point? I love the book of Philippians. It's hard for me to decide if I like Ephesians or Philippians more. It's interesting how Paul feels about the congregation at Philippi and just how special it is to him. What I want to begin looking at, because it's so crucial, is I want to look at the idea of joy and rejoicing in Philippians as a major theme. And then we will come back and start working through the book. And as we work through the book, we'll highlight where each of these mega themes start to be developed as we're going through the letter. Okay, any comments or questions at this point? Look at chapter 1, and I'll start with it like this. Let's see, where did my eraser go? I'll start listing these because I think it will be helpful. And we'll start with the idea of joy. Let's talk about joy and rejoicing. One of them is the noun, the other one is the verb. Okay, so when we start with chapter 1, verse 4, I thank my God every time I remember you. Let's see. In all my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy. So here we discover that prayer is filled with joy. Okay. Does Paul tell us why? Does he give us an indication of why his prayer life is so filled with joy?
Just because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day.
Until now. Now, let's assume, we don't know the date of the book of Philippians, but if it's in the 60s and Paul, maybe he went through Philippi the first time in the 50s. See, this congregation most likely is a decade old. It may be older, but from the first day until now, they have been and they've participated in partnership in the gospel. Now, let's reflect on that a minute, because I think it's helpful for us to apply that to ourselves. How does someone demonstrate? And let's think about Paul and the church at Philippi and what they could do. How would they demonstrate partnership in the gospel with him? What would that look like?
Sending money,
Go ahead, Beth.
sending money for his missions.
There would be money that would be collected that he would receive that would help pay for, day-to-day things while he's traveling. What else? Maybe people offered places for him to stay. Okay.
For the job, because he was a tent maker.
He was a tent maker, so maybe in Philippi they knew where to help him get set up so he could do some tent making. Yeah. Just think of all of the connections of practical things that Paul saw going on with the church at Philippi, of how they were gathering around him and supporting him to be a partner in the gospel. And what's really cool is the members of the congregation, they live there in Philippi. They can't uproot and go gallivanting all over the place like Paul does. Paul is single. He's not married, doesn't have a family. Guess what his calling is? To preach the gospel to the Gentiles. So what does he do? He starts going all over. And he plants churches and then he goes back. Well, not everybody else can do that, but Paul can do it. And they are thrilled as a congregation to participate in the partnership of that. And so what you see here is an early model of a church supporting a missionary, is what it is. Okay? And they have a really close relationship with Paul. That's why, I'll give you an example. We were working with a church up in Michigan, and most churches, at least in the past that I've been aware of, usually will support a missionary, out of their budget. Well, I remember one time in a business meeting, the elder said, well, we don't know this missionary too well. It's been supporting for a while, so we'll just cut his support. So, and I knew the guy. He lived down in Alabama. So I got on the phone. His first name was Jerry. I said, Jerry, you got to get up here. He goes, why? I said, this church is ready to cut off your support because they say they don't know you. When was the last time you were here? Well, it's been about 10 years ago. I said, okay. I said, the church doesn't know you. You got to get up here. So he came up and spent a week with us and preached and taught and ate in people's homes and made that connection so that the church would feel good about being a part of supporting his missionary effort. And that's just a very practical thing. I thought that was kind of interesting. So here's the first model that you're going to find. And his prayer is filled with joy because I would suspect that a lot of the prayer has to do with his thanksgiving for their willingness to step forward, his gratitude for their willingness to step up and help him very practically when others and the other congregations would not. So he has a lot of gratitude in his prayer life, filled with joy for their partnership with him. Okay. Oh, it's time to quit. Well, let's pick up from there. Oh, I'll tell you what y'all can do. Go through this week the book of Philippians and see if you can find other places where joy and rejoicing crops up, and why it is so important to think about the lens through which to see this letter that Paul is expressing to a church that is so dear to his heart. So, well, thank you this morning for coming to Bible class and diving into our first, how do you say it? Dipping our toe in the book of Philippians.